Could Iowa State steal the final number one seed? Which bubble teams are out thanks to bid thievery? We saw a whole bunch of that on Saturday. We're going to break all of this down live as the Selection Sunday show gets underway right here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Welcome into the live selection show reveal here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. I am your host, Andy Patton, joined by my co-host, Isaac Schade. So excited to be able to do this with you all today. We're trying this out. We didn't do this last year. New thing for us, going live while we get through the Selection Sunday. And we're still about 10-ish minutes out until we actually start finding out where all these teams are going to get seated. First of all, this episode is brought to you all by LinkedIn Jobs. Folks, these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. That's why LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster, and they do it for free. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Terms and conditions apply. Isaac, so excited to get this opportunity to recap live as we go through Selection Sunday. And we had an incredible, intense day of college basketball on Saturday. It feels like we've been having that conversation pretty much every Saturday throughout the season. But in a year full of parity, in a year full of more upsets against top-ranked teams than we ever thought, we probably should have known that we were going to get a bunch of bid thieves to end the conference season. We saw Oregon win the Pac-12. That was not expected. They are in the tournament now. We saw NC State rattle off 5 consecutive wins. They are now in the NCAA tournament field out of the ACC. We saw bid thieves in the A10 as well as the AAC as well. And all those teams that were kind of feeling like they were on the right side of the bubble, they're feeling a little bit sweatier as we get 10 minutes away or so from the start of the Selection Sunday show.
Yeah, Andy, I had tweeted just a little bit ago, we had basically 4 bid thieves. You and I were texting about this last night. Basically, who we got a bunch of the A's. ACC was NC State. We had the American, where South Florida lost in the semis. We had the A10 we talked about earlier in the week, where all 4 of the top seeds lost in the quarterfinals. Duquesne ends up stealing the auto bid. And then obviously, as you said, Oregon in the Pac-12. So Andy, what's interesting to me about that is it turns out to me that basically the teams that otherwise would have been the last 4 in and going to Dayton end up being first 4 out, and they're not going to be in the tournament because of all this. And so, Andy, that's going to be tough for them. So obviously we'll kind of realize that as we are going, as you and I are talking, as we see teams that are in and see teams that aren't in, we'll kind of get an idea of what that bubble's looking like.
Yeah, it's funny. It's the concept of a bid thief, for those who maybe aren't as super familiar with the term, is when a team wins the conference and secures the auto bid and they weren't going to make it prior to that. So it's not like a one, like Yale won the Ivy League over Princeton, but that's not a bid thief situation, because either Yale or Princeton or whoever won the Ivy League was going to
Brown in the championship game, right?
Right. But there was never going to be another Ivy League team in the tournament.
Right.
But in the AAC, FAU is probably still going to make it. And they're going to be one of the most intriguing teams to kind of keep an eye on in terms of whether they get one of those bids or not. But UAB is for sure in. They won the AAC. They took that victory there, and they're in. And we saw that a similar situation with the A10. Dayton's still going to make it, but now Duquesne is going to make it as well. So fascinating to see how the bubble is going to kind of shape up. But one of the other big topics here is who's going to be that final number 1 seed, because Isaac, as we get into this, we know with 99.9 etc. percent conviction that the UConn Huskies, the Purdue Boilermakers, and the Houston Cougars are going to secure number 1 seeds, even after Houston got crushed by Iowa State in that Big 12 championship game. But what we're curious about now is who is going to get that final number 1 seed, because we thought it might be Tennessee. They lose to Mississippi State kind of earlier than expected in the SEC. We saw North Carolina lose to NC State, but they did make the ACC championship game. Is that enough for them? And then we see Iowa State roll through the Big 12, the best college basketball conference, crush Houston in that championship game. Now, Iowa State has an incredibly weak non-conference strength of schedule, one of the weakest in literally all of college basketball. Is that going to hold TJ Otzelberger's team back from potentially getting that final number 1 seed? That's something we're really interested in as we get closer to finding out who those top seeds are going to be.
Yeah, Andy, it's going to be really interesting. I mean, it feels like at the end of the day, probably it's still North Carolina for that 4th 1 seed, but it now is definitely not like North Carolina, Tennessee, as we thought at this time last week. It definitely is North Carolina or Iowa State. So that's what we're watching to see, Andy, because as you said, UConn, not only are those teams locked in at the 1 seed line, we already know what regions they're going to be in just because kind of weirdly, they're all separate geographically. So we know that UConn's going to be in the East. That'll be in Boston. Purdue will be the Midwest number 1. That'll be in Detroit, and Houston, the number 1 in the South, which is in Dallas. Now, folks, keep in mind that only relates to the second weekend. The first weekend is not tied to those regions. They will be at other places. But basically what we're talking about with this 4th seed is who's going to be number 1 in the West region that will eventually go out to Los Angeles next week. So that's what we're looking for. And Andy, at this time, even yesterday before the Big 12 championship game, I think you and I both probably would have said North Carolina. Based on the events of last night, it is a conversation that we now have. And look, folks, if you're on the show with us all the time, I was at the Big 12 championship this weekend, and my goodness, on Friday night, it really looked like Houston was going to be the dominant team. Iowa State looked great, but Houston obliterated people. And then last night, Andy, in Hilton South, as they call it, the T-Mobile Arena in Kansas City, because legitimately it was Iowa State would score and it's this obnoxious roar, and Houston scores and it's like, yay, golf clap. Like that was the environment. And so Iowa State just rode that to a big championship win. And so really curious to see what the committee will do there. There'll be some suspense with that because typically we'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll get that 4th. We'll get the West bracket, probably the 4th of all of them.
Granted, we'll be seeing who the 2 seeds are as they come out.
That's a good point too.
If we see Iowa State on the 2 line, if we see Tennessee or Carolina on the 2 line, that'll help us kind of get a sense of who is going to get that final spot. But
and that's true too, because we expect Arizona to probably be the 2 in the West, Andy. And so I think that's a great point. We will find out because we will see either North Carolina or Iowa State pop up earlier as a 2 seed. So that's a very good point from you.
Yeah, I think, I was going to mention Arizona because, I think they played themselves off of being that 1 seed in the West. It feels like they had that, maybe not on lock, but pretty much in the bag for the majority of the season. They had some great non-conference wins early in the season. They played well in the conference, and they didn't have as much wiggle room as some of these other Power 6, top 5 caliber programs, just because the Pac-12 is not very good, and you don't have as many opportunities to pick up quad 1 wins, or your losses are going to be a bit more magnified. And certainly that has been the case with Tommy Lloyd's team. You give up 100 points to Stanford, you get beaten on a buzzer beater by Oregon State. Like, those are the kind of losses that really hurt more in the Pac-12 than they might in the Big 12. And some of that is a bit perception based. I think I know that Clemson's coach Brad Brownell brought that up with the ACC of, like, if you lose in the ACC, it's viewed as worse because their metrics are not as good. And he's kind of been accusing the Big 12 of some gaming the net system, which we got into a little bit when that first came out. But for the Pac-12, like, Tommy didn't have that wiggle room. Like, you really couldn't struggle the way that they did, and they lose to Washington State and they don't win the Pac-12 automatic bid. And I think this is still a really good team, and it's a 2 seed that not a lot of people are going to want to face, but they have played themselves pretty safely outside of that top conversation, which is a bummer because it would have lined up really nice to have them as the 1 seed in the West and just have the geography work out really well with those 4 number 1 seeds.
That's right. And Andy, as we're talking, Jarvis Williams in the chat says, I'm hoping Arizona stays in the 2 line in the West. We're with you, Jarvis. We're looking for that too. Speaking of which, guys, come on in if you're not in the live chat and bring your questions and comments. We'll tackle some of those as we can. In fact, Athir asks, Isaac, I got a question. Do you guys see my Cats on the 3 or 4 line, Andy? I'm assuming he means Kentucky. Going to be really interesting to see. I'm trying to see his icon because it's a football player. I'm assuming that's Kentucky. So,
well, it's probably not Arizona. It's probably not Kansas State. It's probably not Villanova. I think we can probably safely assume that it's a Kentucky question here. I think the Texas A&M loss is going to hurt them. It's going to hurt them a little bit. But again, a lot of the other teams in that 3 seed conversation also took losses we weren't expecting them to take. Like Duke is in that conversation for sure. So to me, Creighton is also in that conversation. So I think Kentucky's probably right on the borderline between a 3 and a 4. I think there's a decent chance they get that last 3 seed, but they've had their resume. I mean, we've kind of talked about it ad nauseum here on the show. It's been very inconsistent with the home losses they shouldn't be taking in non-conference. Some of them in conference play, the Gonzaga loss, but then also some really huge big time wins where they looked like legitimately one of the 3 or 4 best teams in college basketball. They've played at that level, and they have also played at a level well below that. It's somewhat of a staple in John Calipari's era where we've kind of seen that. And I am curious if the committee will reward them with maybe a higher seed because of some of that success, or if, who knows?
So, Andy, it has reached 6:00 Eastern, and that means that the selection show is rolling. I'm seeing it here on CBS. So here's what we need to do. Let's get an ad read going. And then when we come back, we're going to pull up just kind of our bracket to be able to fill in so that those of you who are watching can see that in real time. So, Andy, coming up in just a second, we're going to have the first regions. We'll do some more talking while we wait to see it. But before we get there, I need to tell you that this live episode, by the way, is brought to you by our good friends at Nissan. This week's March Madness bracket highlight is brought to you by our friends at Nissan. Each week, we're picking one team that stands out, a team that's pushed it further than the rest. Just like any of the all-new 2024 Nissan SUVs, these guys were able to take it to the next level. And it's those Iowa State Cyclones we just talked about, Andy. They're obviously this week's Nissan Rogue. The team absolutely surprised us all with the dominating performance against Houston in the Big 12 championship game, locking up the Big 12 tournament championship. They say win life, go Rogue, and that's exactly what the Cyclones have done here. So take the Nissan Rogue, Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. All right, Andy. We're right back into this thing. The East region is rolling right now. I see you typing, so hopefully that means you're typing in some teams. We've got UConn as the number 1 overall. As Andy's typing some of that in, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here so that we can see what's going on. I see a little Locked On Auburn hopping into the chat. What's up, ZB? This is our boss, Zach Blackerby, celebrating his Auburn Tigers having won the SEC tournament championship. Congrats to you, Zach. All right. So, Andy, right out of the gate, whoa, this is hilarious. Okay, UConn is the number 1 overall seed, taking on number 16 Stetson. But, Andy, we immediately go down to the 8-9 game where we've got FAU versus number 9 seed Northwestern. And, Andy, we remember this from last year where Florida Atlantic was in that 8-9 game. That's where they made a run. Memphis was their opponent in that game, although I believe FAU was the 9 seed last year, if I'm remembering correctly. But still, if FAU wants to do it again, run it back, they're going to have to once again knock off a 1. No, they didn't have to knock off a 1 seed because they would have been playing Purdue. So they actually played Fairleigh Dickinson. So, Andy, moving on down the bracket, number 5 seed, we've got San Diego State. The 12 seed there is UAB. And we were just talking about Zach Blackerby and the Auburn Tigers. Well, guess what? They are, Andy, the 4 seed here in the East, and they will be facing Yale, who just at the buzzer beater got that Ivy League championship. So, Andy, what do you make of that top half of this bracket?
Well, I don't know if ZB's planning to travel to Spokane, but that's where that game is. I can give him plenty of recommendations on where to go out in Spokane for that 4-13 between Auburn and Yale. Some really fun matchups here. I'm FAU obviously getting into the tournament. There were some questions of whether they were one of the teams that was going to get bumped by a bid thief situation. That has not been the case. Very intrigued by that matchup with Northwestern. Dusty May has been a really hot topic in some coaching circles as a potential candidate to take some other jobs, including some potential Big Ten jobs. Obviously, Ohio State filled their position, but curious to see if Dusty May can get another win as an 8 seed. Going to be really tough if they end up facing those UConn Huskies. That's a team that I think is going to have a really good opportunity to roll all the way through this thing. But really excited to see FAU back in the tournament. Glad they got one of those bids and glad they don't have to play in that play-in tournament.
That's right. And that is, Andy, one of our first bubble teams that we were watching. They were Joe Lunardi, one of Joe Lunardi's last 4 in. So we know that already. As we carry on with the East bracket, we'll come back to all these, obviously, but we've got BYU as the 6 out of the Big 12. Remember, they're Big 12 now against 11, the Duquesne Dukes. Andy, who win the A10 as that wild conference. So all 4 of its top seeds lose in the quarterfinals. And then right below them, the 3 seed Illinois, fresh off of having just won the Big Ten championship just a couple minutes ago, and they will be playing, excuse me, the 14th seed Morehead State. And then we go on down. We got Wazoo, the 7 seed coming out of the Pac-12. And Andy, on my screen, I'm a little behind, so let me see.
Playing Drake
against Drake.
Yep.
Oh, baby, Andy, talk to us about a father-son combo for the Drake Bulldogs.
Yeah, Darian DeVries and Tucker DeVries, his son, fantastic duo over there. They kind of were trending towards being an 11 seed, so them getting that bump up to the 10 seed is a lot of respect from the committee for them. Washington State, obviously, a fantastic season for them under Coach Kyle Smith. That's a really intriguing matchup. I saw a lot of bracketology reports that had Drake playing a mid-major team. I saw St. Mary's potentially as like a 6-11 matchup. I'm glad they didn't do that. I know that some people might want to make jokes about Wazoo going into the WCC next year, but for now they are a Power 6 team, and I think it's fun to see Drake get an opportunity here. They're a really good team, and that's going to be a really 2 well-coached teams. Kyle Smith's a fantastic, really brilliant coach. Darian DeVries has done a really good job over there. I think that's going to be a really fun game as well.
Andy, we've already got a big answer, and it's, as you said just a little bit ago, the number 2 seed in the East region is the Iowa State Cyclones, the Big 12 tournament champions. And Andy, seeing that, what does it tell us about the 4th 1 seed?
It means the North Carolina Tar Heels are almost certainly, barring some stunning situation where they put Tennessee up there, I think your North Carolina Tar Heels are going to be that 4th and final number 1 seed.
That's what we're learning, folks. So we see that early and ahead. There were some prognosticators, some bracketologists making a late flip to Iowa State as the 4th 1 seed. Andy, we get our answer very early here. And so as you look back at this, man, UConn and Iowa State as your 1 and your 2, the 3 seed here is Illinois, the Big Ten tournament champs, and then the 4 seed Auburn Tigers. So Andy, we've got the top 4 seeds are 4. How about this? 4 of the Power 6 conference tournament champions. What do you make of all this?
I'm not sure I'd be thrilled about this if I'm UConn. Like
exactly.
You're telling me I got to play the Big 12 champion. You're telling me I got to play the SEC champion. You're telling me I got to play the Big 10 champion. All of them are in my bracket. And I know San Diego State technically was not the Mountain West champion. They lost to New Mexico, excuse me. But yeah, that is a pretty intense draw for UConn. Is that's maybe a draw I'd have expected North Carolina to get as that final 1 seed. And instead, we're seeing the only conferences that aren't represented here with their actual tournament champions are the 2 bid thieves. NC State and Oregon are the only 2 that aren't here out of the Power 6. That is a really fascinating first region for us to see here.
Okay, Andy, I'm going to scroll back up to the top of this. The CBS broadcast has gone to commercial. And so we've got a minute while we can just talk about some of these matchups a little more. San Diego State as the 5 seed, by the way, just coming off of finishing as the runner-up in the Mountain West tournament.
Also as a 5 seed.
Also as a 5 seed, as they were last year. How funny that they and FAU wind up in the same region. There will be no rematch from last year's Final Four.
No. I mean, yeah, there's a possibility of a rematch, although that would require, again, FAU to pick a pretty big upset there over UConn. But I'm excited about this matchup. UAB, not a team we expected to see in the field here. But of course, I think a lot of fans might think, oh, that's a team that only snuck in because they won their tournament. I'm not worried about facing them. I think a lot of coaches feel the opposite of that. I don't think they want to I don't think there's a lot of teams out there that want to face NC State, despite the fact that a week ago, nobody even thought about them as an NCAA tournament team, because when you rattle off 4 or 5 wins in a row like that, I think you're starting to feel pretty good, and that confidence is there. And I'm not sure I feel an upset here for UAB necessarily. That would be a tall task, but San Diego State is probably not thrilled to get a team that's playing as good as they are right now. But Brian Dutcher's team's so deep, so talented, so defensively excellent. I think they got a really good chance of advancing here. And if they end up in a second round matchup against Auburn, that's going to be a really intriguing matchup. 2 teams with a lot of depth, a lot of experience, fun, big man matchup between Janai Brome and Jaden Ledee for San Diego State. I think there's some real potential intrigue there. That does require Auburn to get by Yale, who is quality team.
That's right.
Who has already played in Spokane this year, by the way. They played Gonzaga in the season opener for the Zags. But I think Auburn and San Diego State is a very likely second round matchup here, and I think it's a really fun one.
Okay, Andy, also, if I'm remembering correctly, we've got 3 of last year's Final Four right here in the top half of this bracket.
You
UConn,
are absolutely
FAU,
remembering
and
correctly.
San Diego State. That is insane to me, Andy.
Yeah.
And the only team left out is Miami, who's
Mhm.
not going to be in the tournament, period. So
Yeah.
pretty crazy stuff there. Now, Andy, as I'm looking at the chat, there are quite a few Auburn fans upset about being a 4 seed instead of a 3. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think it'll depend on what we see for the rest of the 3 seeds here. I do think Auburn has an argument to be maybe higher than if Duke ends up getting a 3 seed, even Creighton, if they get a 3 seed. Those teams obviously didn't go as far in their conference tournaments. And what we're kind of trying to determine is how much the committee values these very last results, the end of the season results. I think Illinois getting a 3 seed is kind of where they were expected, regardless of whether they won against Wisconsin. But Iowa State getting a 2 seed is probably an indication that maybe those last results weren't all that valued. I think if you're an Auburn fan, I can understand the frustration of, hey, we won the SEC. We won a tournament that, SEC is one of the very best college basketball conferences this year. I mean, unquestionably right at the top there. And I can understand thinking like Duke or Creighton, if they get 3 seed, which I think there's a chance at least one of those teams does, that Auburn would have been more deserving than them. I think that's a reasonable way to feel. But I also think Auburn's got a decent path here. I think San Diego State's beatable. I think they got a real shot to take on a UConn team in the Sweet 16 and maybe make some real noise with a win there. All
right, Andy, we are now getting the South bracket, where Houston, as we expected, is the number 1 seed, number 2 overall. And Longwood, the Lancers, are the 16 seed in the 8-9 game. Andy, this is intriguing. And we get another one of our bubble teams. Texas A&M is the 9, and they will be facing off with Nebraska, the 8 seed. Andy, what do you like in that 8-9 game?
A&M is such an interesting team to me. I get that they got a little boost for that win over Kentucky in the SEC tournament, and I think deservedly so, but they are a really inconsistent offensive team. They're one of the worst three-point percentage teams in the entire country, but when they're on, they are on. Wade Taylor's a fantastic player. They kind of rode him to the finish line this year in a major way. I could absolutely see this being a game where A&M really sticks it to Nebraska because they're shooting well from beyond the arc, spacing that defense. I could also see a situation where, and we've seen this a handful of times this year, where A&M shoots 3 of 20 from 3 and gets buried by the Cornhuskers. They're a very kind of all over the place type of team. I expected them to be a 10, maybe an 11. This is a nice seed for them, but an opportunity for them to prove it as well.
Very telling. Those games will be on Friday in Memphis, Tennessee, probably a FedEx Forum there. Also, Andy, now we've got the 5-12 game. This is intriguing. Wisconsin, who won a weird season for them, Andy, that we've talked about. At one point at the end of January, considered a 1 seed, then lost 8 of 11 down the stretch, and then just raced all the way to the Big Ten championship game, where they will face James Madison, the 12 seed, who, by the way, has beaten a Big Ten seed, a Big Ten team in Michigan State to kick off this season. Very quickly, Andy, before we talk any about that game, let's get to the bottom half of that bracket, where Duke has fallen to the 4 line. I think we expected that based on what's happened here at the end of the season, and they will face Vermont, the fighting Taylor Coppenraths. Andy, why don't you talk about some of those games? I'm going to keep filling in the bracket as they go to the bottom half.
Yeah, shout out James Madison. What an incredible season for them. It feels like they kind of punched themselves a ticket in the NCAA tournament in the first week of the year when they take down Michigan State, they take down Kent State in those 2 phenomenal games. Mark Byington's a phenomenal coach. I think he's going to get himself a hefty deal somewhere else if he chooses to. I know West Virginia's already showing a lot of interest in him, but a great way to even boost that stock, to boost your potential interest in you in the coaching carousel is to go beat a 5 seed, go beat a Wisconsin team, go get 2 wins over the Big Ten. And Wisconsin's coming off this emotional game here against Illinois. It was a hard fought game. They lose. They're going to have to regroup and find a way to beat this Duke's team that is really good and really talented. And then, like you said, Auburn did not get beat by Duke on that 3 line. Obviously, Duke stays in the 4 seed after some end of the season struggles for them. Vermont, one of the most consistent mid-major programs in the country. I would not automatically pencil Duke in on this one. I think Vermont is well coached. They're disciplined. They're talented. I think that they could potentially give Duke a lot of trouble in this one as well. Some really fun matchups already showing up in this one here. I like Texas Tech, NC State as well. 2 Power 6 programs that I think are going to duke it out in a fun way. NC State obviously got a bunch of momentum right now.
They're not going to Dayton, Andy. How about that?
Yeah. They didn't even. Yeah, that's a great point. This is going to be a really fun way to see how these 2 teams duke it out.
Okay, Andy, the other thing, and all the Auburn folks in here with us are going to be freaking out and losing their minds because Kentucky is the 3 seed in the South. And then we get our first, what's up? Brandon Olson's hopping in. Go Gators. Y'all, speaking of Florida, just thoughts and prayers to Micah Handlockton. What a devastating injury that was today in the SEC championship game. If you are squeamish, as Andy texted me earlier today, please do not go watch that. But Florida, the 7 seed, will be facing Boise State and Colorado, the winner of that game, as they head up to Dayton. Andy, that's interesting. I don't know that we had Boise State that low. That's shocking to me. I think we thought Colorado would be right there, and they are. As another one of those bubble teams to hear their name called. Andy, what do you think about any of those games we've rattled off, whether it's Kentucky as a 3, seeing Boise State being a play-in game instead of let's compare 2 teams in this very bracket. How about that? The 11 seed NC State is not a play-in game, but Boise State is. Now that's a 10 and NC State's an 11. I wonder if there's some bracketing principles that dictated that.
Yeah, I'm surprised to see Boise State in this position. It felt like they were fairly safe. I think we kind of knew coming into this bracket that somebody was going to be in a less secure position than we thought. And we still don't know which teams are going to get left off. Obviously, we haven't seen a lot of the bracket, but we haven't seen St. John's, we haven't seen Virginia, Providence, Seton Hall, etc. Some of those teams. But Boise State didn't feel like a team that was in question. And now they got to go take on a tough, physical, talented, veteran Colorado team with Tristan Da Silva, with KJ Simpson, with, of course, superstar freshman Cody Williams. And I think Leon Rice has done an absolutely extraordinary job at Boise State. He's been one of the most consistently excellent mid-major coaches in the country. Hasn't gotten as much love and attention as I think maybe they deserve. And part of that is that they haven't done a lot in the NCAA tournament. They've made it a few times. I don't think they've won a game. And now they get a tough draw here to even kind of get into that situation where they get to face Florida. They got to beat a Colorado team that I think they're capable of beating, but this is not where they expected to be. I think they were hoping to be an 8-9 seed and not have to be in that play-in conversation in Dayton.
All right, Andy, let's just mention a couple of the bubble teams that we've already seen come in as the CBS broadcast goes to break. Then we'll take another ad break, and then we'll come back and talk about the final 2 brackets as they're revealed. Texas A&M is in, FAU is in, Colorado is in. We're still waiting to see Mississippi State, TCU, Colorado State, Michigan State, Oklahoma, and then other teams that we think might be below the cut line, like St. John's, Virginia. Unfortunately, Indiana State. I was really hoping to see Robbie Avila's rec specs. Andy, we'll see Seton Hall, Pitt, Providence, K-State, and South Florida, amongst some others. Now, Andy, let's come back to the South region here, where Marquette is the 2 seed. Interesting that, I think this to me says that the committee firmly believes that Tyler Kolek is going to be good to go this week, and that's why they've given them a 2. For those who are unaware, Tyler Kolek, the reigning, well, I guess not anymore because there's a new Big East Player of the Year, but last year's Big East Player of the Year is Tyler Kolek, who has been out since the final 2 games of the regular season for Marquette, didn't play at all in the Big East tournament, and we expect to see him back. Could be gamesmanship, could be really reality. We're not sure, but Andy, Marquette and Kentucky as the 2 and 3 in the bottom half of the South, along with Florida. We know Leaf Tulane, our guy, loves this Florida team. And then the 1 and the 4 at the top half, Houston and Duke. Any other thoughts on this region before we go to another ad break, Andy?
Yeah, I think if I was UConn, I'd rather have this one without a
Honestly.
doubt. Marquette with a potentially banged up Tyler Kolek, a Kentucky team that's been wildly inconsistent this year, a Duke team that's struggling down the stretch. Wisconsin hasn't played like a 5 seed since the beginning of the year. Like I'm not saying this is a bad region, but it's certainly not as daunting as the region that we just covered with where UConn is. So if I'm Houston, I feel pretty good about where I'm at. I think Nebraska A&M is a tough 8-9 matchup for them. But then after that, they get either Wisconsin or Duke, both teams that I think are pretty beatable. So if I was a Houston fan, I think I'd feel pretty good about how this region lined up for them.
Yeah. Very much so. All right, Andy, before we I'm expecting that we're going to get the Midwest next because I think Purdue's going to be the number 3 overall. So before we get to that Midwest reveal and see who all along with Purdue, Andy, make a prediction really quick. Who's going to be the 2 in the Midwest?
Who is left that hasn't been
Tennessee?
Yeah, I think it's probably Tennessee because Arizona's the 2 in the West. So I think
what we
it's
think.
got to be Tennessee. Yeah.
All right. Well, we'll find out if Andy and I are right about Tennessee coming up in just a second. right after we tell you that this live episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs, which has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. Thankfully, LinkedIn isn't just some other job board. They've got a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, making it the best place to hire. Gives you access to professionals you can't find anywhere else. And LinkedIn does all of this while making the process easy and intuitive. Hiring is easy when you have that many quality candidates. So easy, in fact, that 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing a ton of hats and might not have the time or resources to hire, so they're constantly finding ways to make the process easier. In fact, they've got a new feature to help you write job descriptions. So if you want to get in on that, post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Again, that's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, Andy Patton and Isaac Schade here with you, live reacting to the bracket as it is unveiled. And on CBS, we're back and we're headed off, as we expected, to the Midwest bracket where Purdue is the 1 seed. Andy, it's almost like we know this stuff and we talk about it all year long. Andy, Purdue is going to be facing, we don't know as of yet, but still to come. We've got some fun teams we're waiting to see. All right, we've got our first automatic qualifier playing game, and it's going to be Grambling State against, I missed who it was because they went to give us a shot at Grambling really quick. So waiting on that. Grambling and Montana State out of the Big Sky. Andy, I'll let you.
Shout out Montana State, by the way. Danny Sprinkle was their head coach last year. They had a ton of success. He goes to Utah State, has a massive success there, obviously, in year one, is now being looked at as like a potential replacement for Hopkins at Washington. And yet Montana State, despite losing this really great coach, finds a way to fight through the Big Sky tournament. They were, can't remember off the top of my head where they were seeded, but I think they were a 5 seed, if I'm remembering correctly. And they find their way back into the big dance. Good for them. Good for the Bobcats.
Okay. We now go to the 8-9 game. Utah State.
That Utah State team.
Oh, how funny is that, Andy?
Yeah. All Montana State has to do is beat Grambling and then Purdue, and then you get that matchup. Utah State, Montana State, the Danny Sprinkle game. That's easy peasy, right? Purdue's never lost to a 16 seed before. So.
Never. Okay, Andy, we've got another bubble team. TCU is the 9 seed out of the Big 12. So we're starting to just learn more and more about the shape of the bubble. Andy, the number 5 seed has just popped up. It's a team from Gonzaga.
Oh, you're kidding.
The Bulldogs, the 5 seed, facing off against Will Wade and McNeese in the 5-12 game. Andy, what do you make of that kind of matchup? You know anything about Gonzaga this year?
I am absolutely stunned. A 5 seed if they had beat St. Mary's in the WCC championship game, I thought a 5 seed was possible. In fact, I even alluded to, hey, it might even be probable. But they didn't. They didn't beat St. Mary's in that championship game.
So you thought it would be a 6?
I thought they'd be a 7. I was pretty convinced they were going to be a 7 seed, and here they are as a 5 seed. They got to take on a really good McNeese team, but
very
they get a 5 seed in Salt Lake. That is a dream draw for Mark Few and the Zags. And I mean, again, now we're just finding out right now their second matchup is against Kansas. If they can get past McNeese, that's a tough draw. Of course, Kansas very good, but they are susceptible this year to some struggles with some lack of depth. We've talked about it a bunch on the show. Wow, that's a surprising result for the Zags, and not as surprising for Kansas. I think they slipped their way into that 4 seed conversation with that bad loss to Cincinnati in the Big 12 tournament.
Well, Andy, we're also assuming there by making that statement that Kansas is going to be healthy with Hunter Dickinson and Kevin McCullough, which is interesting. But also, do you see who they're playing?
I do.
The Samford Bulldogs. By the way, I got to shout out perhaps the biggest Samford Bulldogs fan I know, Mr. Caden Peterson down there, whose dad is my good friend Joe and a professor at Samford. What's up, Caden Hal June? Good to see you, buddy. But Samford plays a very unique style of basketball that we call buckyball. They press on every possession. Interestingly enough, think about this, Andy. Kansas doesn't have much depth. How are they going to be able to face that? We're obviously going to talk about that a lot more this week, but could be a very interesting game there. All right, next we've got South Carolina as the 6th seed. You're already typing this in, and they're facing the 11th seed Oregon, fresh off of winning the final Pac-12 tournament. So, Andy, both of these AQs, Oregon and NC State, both are able to avoid a play-in game in Dayton. How about that?
Yeah, I think they're giving them a little respect for winning those conference tournaments there. I think Oregon, South Carolina is a fun matchup. N'Faly Dante is an absolute load that South Carolina is going to have to defend. He's a beast for them in the front court. Jackson Shelstead, star freshman for Oregon, has been really, really good. Really curious to see how that plays out. But Lamont Paris's team has been fantastic all year long. I wouldn't be surprised to see them advance there and potentially give Creighton all their worth if Creighton can get by the Akron Zips, a team that I kind of like a lot coming out of the
who, by the way, should not be in this tournament. Andy, why not?
Yes, that Kent State game was just tragic to watch.
Okay, Andy, play-in game. We just got two more bubble teams. Virginia and Colorado State are headed to Dayton. That means that both Colorado and Colorado State are going to be in Dayton, Andy. That's pretty interesting.
What it also means is if you're a St. John's or Providence fan, you're feeling really sweaty right now, because I think a lot of people didn't expect Virginia to sneak into this conversation. Personally, I thought Virginia was out after everything that happened on Saturday, but it looks like Tony Bennett's team is in. Also, Texas is kind of overseeded here, in my opinion. 7 seeds pretty high for them. I know they're a good team, and no disrespect to them, but I really thought they were going to kind of fall in that 8-9 seed line, and they get a bump up here to a 7 seed. I'm curious what that potentially means for some other teams in that conversation, like potentially St. Mary's, who we have not seen yet, who is probably not going to get as high a seed as Gonzaga, which I imagine is going to be make some people in Moraga, California pretty darn unhappy.
All right. And then, Andy, as we predicted, Tennessee is the 2 seed here. Way to go, us. But look who they're playing. Number 15, St. Peter's. Andy, this is the exact seed, the 15 seed that St. Peter's was 2 years ago when they raced all the way to the Elite Eight before falling
an SEC team,
before falling to North Carolina. Yes, and it was an SEC team, the Kentucky Wildcats, who they knocked off to do so. I love how the bracket gives us this stuff. And by the way, folks, these are not manufactured. There's so many bracketing principles in place that they can't make it up, but we're loving to see this. So
if
Andy,
they wanted to manufacture something here, they would have put St. Peter's as the 16 against Purdue, because St. Peter's beat Purdue 2 years ago, and Purdue has a history now of losing to mid-major schools from New Jersey as a 16 seed. So if they wanted to really narrative this thing up, they would have for sure made St. Peter's that 16 seed. But this is a fun spot for them to be, again, back in that 15 line, playing a tough SEC team, Tennessee team that Rick Barnes, I mean, they desperately need to kind of move past some of the stigmas that he has had, not doing as well in March as he should. And certainly St. Peter's upsetting them would really put a big stain on that Vols team.
Andy, that means, as we anticipated, when we get to the West in a minute, North Carolina is probably going to be the 1, and Arizona is probably going to be the 2. Obviously, we'll have to talk about the possibility of getting a Caleb Love and North Carolina reunion. That will be a major storyline this week. Obviously, let's go back up to the top half of this bracket, where, again, we've got the 1 seed Purdue, Kansas the 4, Gonzaga the 5. We've got the Utah State TCU 8-9 game. And then so before we go back to the bottom half, what do you kind of make of that?
Yeah, I think we talked a lot about Gonzaga and Kansas already, so I'll talk about this Utah State TCU matchup. I think that's a really fun one. Utah State, I thought they might sneak into that 7 conversation. I thought that they were kind of in that. I think they probably would have needed to at least make the Mountain West championship game to really be in that spot. Now they kind of get this not so fun 8-9 line. TCU, I probably pushed Oklahoma out with the win over them. I think we haven't seen Oklahoma yet, and that's probably not a great sign for Porter Moser's team, but TCU has played some really good basketball at times this year. I think that's a fun matchup between 2 pretty physical teams. We'll see if Grado Sabor can be a problem for the Horned Frogs. But yeah, both those teams, I think, have the potential to give Purdue some serious trouble. I'm assuming Purdue is going to advance as much as people want to make that joke. But honestly, both Utah State and TCU are very capable of making life a little bit more difficult for Zach Edey and potentially causing some problems for them. But I do think if you're a Purdue fan, you got to feel at least pretty good. Although Tennessee and a 3-seeded Creighton team, when those 2 teams are on, they're really good. And I could see that being a problem for the Boilermakers.
Andy, back down on the bottom half of the bracket, a couple people are saying in the chat here on the live YouTube show that Tennessee has a pretty nice draw as a 2 seed. You know, St. Peter's, assuming, they can get past them. And then the winner of Texas, Virginia, Colorado State. Boy, if it's Virginia, that's going to be a defensive lockdown. And then Creighton, you know, we've seen them be incredible. We've seen them go not as incredible. And then South Carolina and Oregon. So, I mean, you know, you think back to that East bracket that we had and what UConn's going to have to deal with. I think that both Purdue and Tennessee are feeling pretty good about their halves of this Midwest bracket, Andy.
Yeah, I think so too. If I'm a Tennessee fan, like I feel good about the overall bracket, but I will say one of the things for me personally that often indicates success in March, just kind of from the eyeball test, is veteran guard play. And the three potential teams that Tennessee could face in the second round, assuming again they get by the Peacocks, Texas has Max A. Smith, Virginia has Reese Beekman, Ryan Dunn, who's more of a guard wing hybrid. Colorado State has Isaiah Stevens. Like those are three really good veteran older guards. I think all three of these teams are well coached teams, but none of them have really. Colorado State has probably played at expectation at times. Texas and Virginia have not exceeded expectations. They've been below expectations. So I think that's why Tennessee is probably feeling like, hey, this is a pretty good draw for us. But just because they haven't quite met those expectations doesn't mean these teams aren't good and doesn't mean they can't cause some problems. But it's hard to not feel good if you're Tennessee, if you're facing a 7-seeded Texas in the second round, a Texas team that has had injury issues throughout the year that hasn't played up to their level. I think, you're probably feeling pretty good as a Vols fan.
All right, Andy, as expected, we are now moving on to the West region where North Carolina is in fact the 1 seed. They will play the winner of Howard and Wagner. These games will be Thursday and Saturday in Charlotte, North Carolina. And so, Andy, obviously it'll be a talking point for us about North Carolina versus Iowa State. That's going to be something that's going to be much discussed this week. And then we get another one of our bubble teams as the 8 seed, Mississippi State. Oh, and another bubble team, Michigan State, is the 9.
Wow.
Andy, Tom Izzo keeps the streak alive. Did you think we would see Michigan State in this tournament?
Yeah, I did. I did think Michigan State was going to make it. They were one of the teams that I wasn't as concerned about potentially falling all the way out of the field. But again, I didn't expect Boise State was going to be in the spot that they were in. But the committee's probably, again, they're not using narratives, but unless Tom Izzo's team clearly didn't deserve it, I think they were going to find their way in. But to set up a potential second round matchup, again, no disrespect to Mississippi State, they're very capable of winning that game. But if Tom Izzo's team, which they love March, if they can advance, Michigan State versus North Carolina, a blue blood style matchup in the round of 32, that is what makes college basketball so dang fun. And that's appointment television if that game ends up happening.
But you know what I would love to see? Tolu Smith and Armando Bacot in the post. That would be a lot of fun if Mississippi State and North Carolina both advance. And then we've got St. Mary's as the 5 seed. Wow. So both West Coast Conference teams get 5 seeds, and they will play Bryce Drew. He of one of the greatest shots in NCAA tournament history, Grand Canyon against St. Mary's out of the WCC and the WAC, the 4 seed. Alabama and their elite offense, but their woeful defense, and they will face off against Pat Kelsey and Charleston. So that'll be an interesting top half of the West bracket here. So, Andy, going to be really interesting in the top half. Let's quickly go ahead and go. They're going to move on to the bottom half here on the show. So we're going to keep filling this out, and then we'll come back around to those games. Clemson is the 6th seed here in the West bracket in the bottom half. Is that the 4th ACC team? I know there was a lot of talk. I think that's kind of what we expected.
It's the 5th ACC team because NC State, Duke, Carolina, and Virginia are all in.
Oh, yes, Virginia got in. So that's going to be a talking point is the ACC getting 5. Obviously, that means 4 at-larges. Clemson will face the number 11 seed New Mexico Lobos. What a week for the Lobos. Andy, perhaps they and Wisconsin had the 2 biggest weeks for themselves this week. Baylor, the 3 seed, fresh off of getting beat on Friday night in the Big 12 semifinals by Iowa State, will face Colgate, the winner of the Patriot League, who, if I remember correctly, won the regular season by 6 games, Andy, and then won the Patriot League Conference Tournament. And then Dayton, the 7 seed, who will be...
Yeah, that's what we're waiting on.
Nevada.
Oh, sorry, St. John's.
So, Andy, yes, this is what we immediately learn.
Yeah.
This means Oklahoma misses the tournament. This means St. John's, Indiana State, Seton Hall, Pittsburgh, Providence, K-State, South Florida all missed the tournament. And
this means, Isaac, the 6 teams out of the Boise, or 6 teams out of the Mountain West, 5 teams out of the ACC, and 3 teams out of the Big East. That is very surprising.
Wow. And I think, though, that's what we thought would happen.
The Big East they beat themselves up too much. I mean, it was just, the Villanovas and the Providences and St. John's, Seton Hall, they just some combination of not a strong enough non-conference strength of schedule, too many losses in conference play. Like, all of those teams had warts on their resume. And once we had that big bid thief situation on Saturday, you kind of saw the writing on the wall. And right. I mean, honestly, a storyline we can talk about here, New Mexico, they may not have made it. And the fact that they won the Mountain West tournament puts them in the field, pushes St. John's out of the field. That's a little bit of a son on father crime there, as Richard Pitino, for the head coach for New Mexico, potentially was one of the reasons that his dad, Rick Pitino, and St. John's don't make the field here, despite a really strong finish to the season for the Johnnies.
Yeah, in fact, I'm literally just tweeting, well, we got a Pitino in the tournament, but it's Richard and not Rick. So, Andy, so that means we know the 68 teams, because, by the way, if you've done your math or you know who it is, Long Beach State is the final team into this tournament. And, Andy, before we go to analyzing some more of this and doing some wrap-up, why is it interesting that Long Beach State won their conference tournament?
Because they fired their coach. We've seen this happen a handful of times this year and in years past, where a team makes the decision to part ways with their head coach coming in to the conference tournament. I'm not sure why programs do that. I don't know why they don't wait until the final game of the season, but Long Beach State, after 17 years for Dan Monson at Long Beach State, he spent 8 years at Minnesota before that. Prior to that, he was the architect of Gonzaga's miracle run to the Elite Eight in 1999 that catapulted their success as a program. Monson gets fired by Long Beach State before the Big West tournament caps off, and then he goes and wins the dang thing. They let him keep coaching. Now Long Beach State is in the tournament, first time since 2012. Monson talked about it after the game. He was quoted, he said he got a text from Mark Few, who said, "You made a deep run your first year. Why don't you go make a deep run this year as well?" And it's a really fun story for Monson. I feel bad for him for, kind of getting a lot of attention effectively for getting fired, but he put this team into the big dance, and now they got a chance to play against a coach he knows very well, and Tommy Lloyd, another former Gonzaga coach at Arizona.
Andy, I have on my desk here a Post-it note I've been saving since our last pregame show of the preseason. Now is the time for me to read it to you. You ready?
Yes, hit me.
You and I made Final Four predictions before the season began, and I have been saving. This is the moment. Here we go. Andy's preseason Final Four predictions. Creighton, they have a chance. They could do it. They're in the tournament. Duke, they have a chance. They're in the tournament. Arizona, they have a chance. They're in the tournament. And Arkansas, they are not in the tournament. They do not have a chance. Isaac also had Creighton and Tennessee and Purdue and Texas. So all 4 of my teams are in, but I haven't even processed enough of this to think if any of these teams are all in the same region together or not. But I just wanted to read that off in real time. So Andy, out of your 3 Final Four teams that actually are in this dance, without looking at their games, I'm just more interested in the way they're playing right now. Yeah. Which of those 3, Creighton, Duke, or Arizona, do you feel best about?
Yeah, not a lot of teams that have a lot of momentum right now coming into this spot. I think Creighton's maybe the team I feel the best about, but they just
on my way back to Creighton. Yeah.
I just have such a hard time imagining them rattling off the 6 games in a row, just because they've had so many inconsistencies. We'll see them play great for 3 or 4 games and then just have a huge stinker of a game. They have 4 really talented starters. Mason Miller is not contributing offensively. We've kind of joked about that a few times on the show. And I don't think Creighton needs him to score 10 a game, but they need him to score more than 0 per game. And certainly if they're not getting any points off the bench, there's just so much pressure on Ashworth and Alexander, and of course Baylor Shireman and Kalkbrenner. But I think Creighton, when they're on, they're capable of rattling off 6 in a row. It's just hard to know if they're going to be consistent enough to make that kind of run. But I do trust them over a Duke team that really limped to the finish line, and an Arizona team that has struggled defensively at times. I think Arizona's very good, but I think I have a little bit more confidence in Creighton being that Final Four team.
Well, Andy, here's the bummer for me that I've just realized as I'm looking at this Midwest bracket. You see the bottom half of it there? Are you looking on the screen?
Yes, I am.
My teams, let me remind you, were Creighton, the 3 seed in the Midwest, Texas, the 7 seed in the Midwest, Tennessee, the 2 seed in the Midwest. So 3 of my 4 are all in the bottom of the same bracket, and Purdue, who is the 1 seed in this same bracket. So Andy, I like some of my choices, but they're all in the same bracket. I literally can only get one of, but you know what? I feel good about getting at least one of my preseason Final Four choices. All right, Andy, as we went through this quick. I'm going to give you two options of where to go, and I'll let you choose. Do you want to look more at who you think got snubbed, or would you like to go back and look at any specific things in one of the regions?
Let's talk about the snubs. I saw a graphic that popped up on the screen during the CBS show that showed the net rankings for the team, the last four in, the first four out. They mentioned Indiana State. Indiana State was 29th at the net to finish out the season. If I remember correctly, that is the best ever that has not made the field. I believe no team outside the top 30 failed to make the NCAA tournament as an at-large bid. I know as the host of Locked On Zags that was a big talking point when there was a lot of consternation about whether Gonzaga would get an at-large bid before their strong end of the season. And they were like 23rd in the net. Like there's no way a top 30 team or a top 25 team is going to get left out. But this year, because of the bid thief situation, we kind of knew this was a realistic possibility. And we see a Pitt team that was, I think, right around 40th in the net. They get left off. We see Indiana State 29th in the net. And for starters, the net hasn't been around that long.
That's right.
So the data is, it's a small sample size of data, but I don't necessarily disagree with Indiana State being left out of the field. To be honest, I love them. I'm sad we don't get to see Robbie Avila in the tournament. Yeah. I think they're a really fun team. Josh Schertz is a great coach, but I can look at the resume and objectively understand why they did not make it, especially in light of everything that happened on Saturday. But I'm less surprised they're not in. I'm a little more surprised St. John's didn't get in. I know their resume was a little bit all over the place as well, with some. They had a lot of how many 2 to 3 point games that they have in the Big East. I swear they lost 6 of their games by 1 or 2 points. And honestly, they may have only needed to win one of those in order to make the field. And that is a tough pill for Patino and the Johnnies to swallow. But if you're a St. John's fan, as much as this may hurt, you're still in a heck of a lot better position than you were at this time last year. So hopefully some better days to come for that team.
Andy, I love the comment from Howard in the chat. He says, well, Rick Pitino said his team was no good. LOL. I guess the committee listened. And so
that's great. Spot on. Well done, Howard.
So, Andy, Qui-Gon Jack says St. John's put up 90 against UConn the other night. I'm a UConn fan. And even though we won that game against our amazing defense, that should be a sign to the committee. I mean, that there's very much something to that. So we're going to have to watch that. By the way, folks, if you've got any other observations or questions you'd like us to answer before we get out of here, please feel free to drop those in the live chat and we'll see if we can grab a couple of those.
Can I make a note on a game too that we didn't talk much about?
Yes.
St. Mary's Grand Canyon.
Yeah, let me get back to that. Is that West?
Yeah, in the West.
Yep.
Obviously, I mentioned when Gonzaga got the 5 seed that I thought they were I didn't think they would put both Gonzaga and St. Mary's in the 5 line. Obviously, the committee has a lot of respect for the WCC, which is fantastic to see. As a champion of the WCC myself, I'm very happy to see them get that kind of love and respect. 2 really good programs. But the matchup against Grand Canyon, that's tough. 2 really good mid-major programs. Grand Canyon has been dominant throughout the season. Very few losses in conference play. They won some big games in the non-conference. They beat San Francisco, a team that was the clear third in that WCC. I think that's a really fun matchup. 2 kind of different styles. Grand Canyon's not as slow it down, grind it out style the way that Randy Bennett and the Gales play, but that is a game that I would highly recommend for folks who are East Coasters, for folks who don't pay a lot of attention to West Coast basketball. Circle that one on your calendar because I think that's going to be a really fun one and highlight 2 really, really good programs that aren't getting a ton of love out West.
Speaking of which, if St. Mary's and Alabama both win and face in the second round, that would be an elite offense who has a porous defense against an incredible defense. It's got a pretty good offense. And so, Andy, that would be a really interesting matchup. Speaking of which, I'm interested to go back and look. There's 3 teams we've been talking about quite a bit lately that each have an elite offense with a defense that is outside the top 90. That's obviously this Alabama team. We also had Kentucky.
Yeah, Kentucky.
Where were they at? Do you remember which bracket Kentucky's in? I don't have my head right.
They're in the East.
They're in the East. I was just on it and left it. No, they're in the Midwest.
Oh, well, that's why.
No.
Yeah, both Kentucky and Alabama outside.
South. I'm sorry. Kentucky's in the South.
Yeah.
It was Illinois that's in the East.
Gotcha.
So of those 3 teams, there we go. I've got it now. Illinois is the 3 in the East. where UConn, again, remember, that game would be fun. Illinois is the 3 in the East. Kentucky is the 3 in the South. And then Alabama, the 4 in the West. Andy, out of those 3 teams that we've been talking about a good bit here, who lasts the longest? Let me ask it that way.
That's a good question. I'd have to study more on some of the actual regions they're in, but my gut is going to tell me Illinois. They got that hard fought victory they just got over Wisconsin. They're a really good, talented team. When Shannon's playing well, Coleman Hawkins is playing well. A top 5 offense in the country. Granted, Kentucky and Alabama are legitimately also top 5 offenses in the country, so a lot of intrigue there. But I trust Illinois a little bit more. Alabama has been inconsistent at times. Kentucky is like the kingpin of inconsistency at times. I think Kentucky is the team that has the highest ceiling out of this group. I think Alabama is the team that has probably the lowest floor out of the group, while I think Illinois is probably the most consistent kind of team that's most likely to perform to expectation. So while I think Kentucky is the most likely out of this trio to actually win a national championship, they're also the most likely to get upset early, whereas I'm pretty likely to pencil Illinois in for a couple of W's.
Yeah, man, that's the interesting thing with Kentucky is they probably feel like of those 3, they have the widest possibility. Andy, I tell you what, we've got about 18 more shows each to record tonight, most of which are together. Obviously, we're going to get to picks and doing all that. That's not really the purpose of this show. This show is just to kind of reveal and react to the bracket. Been a great crowd hanging out with us in here. We're so grateful to everyone for doing that. So, Andy, I think we should probably call that good and get out of here. Obviously, we'll have the Dayton games, the play-in games starting Tuesday night. We'll have 2 of those. And then Wednesday night, we'll have 2 of those. And then Thursday, baby, it is all off and running. Cannot wait for that. So for Andy, I'm Isaac. We are so grateful to all of you for tuning in with us. Make sure that you are with us throughout March Madness. We're going to be bringing you great content all the time. We'll have our normal Monday show coming out tomorrow. Later on tonight, we're going to record a ridiculously long show with all sorts of going through all 4 brackets. So we'll do a lot more of that. If you're not part of the Locked On College Basketball Discord community, we'd love to have you in there. If you haven't subscribed to our show, please come do that right now. It's so easy to hit that like button and smash that as well. By the way, hit the bell so that you can get right in with us when we go live like this, which we will do on nights after tournament, like Thursday night late as the tournament's winding down. We'll go live and you want to know when that comes out. All right. So make sure you're with us all March long. We want to say, as always, apologies to the lawyer family. Let's go Wildcats. And until tomorrow and later tonight, we'll talk to you then. Peace.